Welcome, travelers, to my realm of nightmares. Allow me to be your personal assistant. Come in, take a seat, get comfortable. For when you step into my realm, there's no stepping out.
The nights were always cold and hazy in the winter. This night was particularly chilly. The clouds were rumbling, and streaks of lightning illuminated the dark night sky. I squirmed around, trying my best to fall asleep. I spent the entire night just rolling around in bed, trying my best to fight my insomnia. As hard as I tried to empty my mind, it was clearly at a sync with my physical need for rest. I knew exactly what the root cause of my insomnia was, but tonight was not the night to address it. Tonight, I just wanted to sleep. I had just started to doze off when I was jerked awake by a fluorescent blue light. I wasn't accustomed to fluorescent lights invading my sleep, and thus, my body reacted impulsively. I pulled the covers off me, switched on the lamp, and sat on the edge of the bed. It must have been the light from a passing vehicle. I got up and closed the curtains. As I walked back to bed, I felt a tingle in my ear, and I quickly dashed to the bathroom. I switched on the light and turned to the left side of my head to the mirror to catch a glimpse of the inner of my ear where a tingling pain was coming from. My heart raced when I saw something move quickly inside. My throat catched as I tried to comprehend what I had just seen. Had I just seen something crawl inside? I saw it, just as it made its way inside. At least, I thought I did. Although my eyes were still adjusting to the light, and my mind was trying to make sense of this pain I was feeling, I suppose it could have been my head playing tricks on me. What could it have been anyway? Is it that big of a deal? If it was a small insect that wouldn't do any harm? But then again, it could have been a spider. It did kind of look like it had quite a few legs. I tilted the left side of my head downward, slapping it multiple times with my palm, in a bind to get whatever insect had entered my ear out. I was disappointed, however, when nothing came out. Perhaps I hadn't seen anything enter after all, and my eyes were merely deceiving me. I went back to bed, convinced I was half asleep and hallucinating. Eventually, I finally managed to fall asleep, though not for a long period of time. I'm not sure how much time had passed when I was startled awake by my doorbell. The sun shone in brightly through the edge of the curtain. It was already morning? I hated my brain. I hated the sun. I hated everything that didn't let me sleep. I drugged myself up to answer the incessant ring of the doorbell. I opened the door to the presence of Wright Shane, my colleague. He was a short-tempered man and didn't have much of a sense of humor, but he was a good guy. He looked super surprised to see me in my nightgown. I was ruffled, and it was obvious I had just woken up. In comparison, he was dressed sharply, and his tailored suit fit his tall frame perfectly. "Morning, Susan." Hey, Wright," I replied, half yawning. "What's up? I wasn't expecting you." "What do you mean?" "You asked me to pick you up on my way to work today." "Oh, I did," I replied, feeling embarrassed. I took a second to collect my thoughts as I stared back at him blankly. "Yeah, you did." "I must have forgotten. I'm sorry." "That's been happening a lot lately, Susan." "I know that, right? Thank you for the reminder. Come inside. Just, give me 20 minutes. I held the door open for him to enter. He came inside, and I closed the door behind him. He made his way into the living room and sat on the couch as he turned on the TV. I made my way upstairs and took a quick shower. As I was finishing up, I began to hear strange voices in my ear. They were hushed voices at first, and then they turned into roars of indistinct voices. It was as if multiple people were speaking to me at the same time. My head was pounding as I tried fruitlessly to process what I was going through. I turned off the shower and wrapped a towel around my waist. "Right!" I called as I stepped out of the bathroom, unable to walk straight. I heard no response, so I yelled out his name again. I bent down to my knees, unable to hold off this migraine any longer. I was startled by Wright, who bent down in front of me. I could tell he was speaking to me, but I couldn't hear anything he was saying. I shook my head, making him aware I couldn't hear. He helped me to my feet as I held on to my towel. We stood for a few seconds until the pain eventually began to reduce. "You okay?" he asked. "I'm sorry. I don't know what that was. I got a terrible headache. I've been getting them a lot lately. Just not like this. They haven't been this bad." "That's not normal," he said. "You have to see a doctor." I shook my head no as I walked back into the bathroom. I put on my clothing and glanced up at my reflection staring back. I was unable to recognize the woman I saw in the mirror. She had dark bags under her eyes and more wrinkles than I recognized. She looked pathetic. The kind of woman I used to pity. I walked out of the bathroom and walked downstairs, dreading facing Wright. After that little show I put on, I hated feeling weak, much less looking the part in front of anyone. "I'm ready," I said to him, nodding towards the door. "You need to stay home today," he said as he stood up. "That, or go see a doctor." "I'll see a doctor, but I'm ready to go until then." "I'm good, Wright. I'm not staying home today." He stared intently into my eyes, almost as if measuring my resolve. He didn't say anything and walked past me to the front door. I got into his vehicle and we headed off to the office. There was no way I was missing work today. There was a briefing we had to attend. After that, we were supposed to head somewhere just outside city limits to conduct an interview. Wright and I worked for the Internal Revenue Services. We conducted interviews on behalf of the United States government. As you can imagine, we're not very popular with most people. Our work is mundane. Most of it takes place behind a desk on a computer. But we get our fair share of excitement when we conduct interviews. The interviews serve the purpose of identifying fraudulent activity. People's reactions can be quite extreme, and it's not an easy job to have if you're unable to handle stress. You must also have a strong mental resolve, which is why I'm trying my best to ensure Wright, nor anyone else at the IRS, gets a whiff of my current dilemma. I've been experiencing delusions lately, if I must be completely honest. In addition to hiding it from everyone else, I suppose I'm still trying to lie to myself about it. My mother suffered from schizophrenia, a psychiatric disorder that tends to be hereditary. One of my biggest fears in life has always been to end up the way she did at the end of her life. "Are you even listening to me?" Wright yelled at me as he hit my arm with the back of his hand. "Yeah, what's up?" I replied. "Look, it's not my place to say this," he said, tapping the steering wheel nervously. "It's none of my business. We've known each other for a long time, and I can tell something is up. I'm just letting you know. You can talk to me about anything." He glanced at me for a second, but quickly turned his attention back to the road. I've known Wright for years, and this is probably the most intimate thing I've ever heard him utter. I took a deep exhale and wiped the sweat from my hands on my slacks. "So, you know how I told you about my mom? About how she died when I was a kid?" He nodded. So, she didn't really die. I mean, she died eventually, but not how I described. She must have been about 35 or something when she started experiencing paranoid delusions. She was diagnosed with schizophrenia not long after. She would get quite violent. They took her away, not to a mental institution or anything like that. She was arrested one night. I didn't know what happened at the time. Nobody told me. They just said she wasn't coming back. She eventually died in prison a few years later. Jesus. I'm sorry, Susan. I didn't know. That was on purpose, I responded. I've always been kind of private about that aspect of my life. But anyways, the reason I'm telling you now is because, well, this is hard to say. I think I'm going through some similar issues. You think you have the same thing your mom had? I don't know, I replied. I haven't been diagnosed or anything like that. You need to get checked out, he barked, turning to look at me. Checked out? I replied. I'm not some kind of animal. That's not what I meant, Susan, he retorted. Look, it can be dangerous out there if something were to happen. That's all I'm saying. Dangerous for who? I asked. For you? Or for me? Wright didn't respond. He just kept looking straight ahead. Look, I know that. Don't you think I know that? I finally said, to break the silence. That's exactly why I'm not ready to confront this situation yet. I know it's going to happen if I get diagnosed with that illness. Right. They'll let me go. As pathetic as this sounds, this job is all I have. Worse than that, if I do have that thing, then it's only a matter of time until I end up like her. You don't even know if that's what it is yet, right? He said loudly. There's only one way to find out. Wouldn't you rather know? I punched him in the arm and returned to smile. We drove in silence for several minutes until I finally spoke up. Alright, I'll take the rest of the week off. I'll call and make an appointment as soon as possible. I think you're right. Having one of my breakdowns in the field is not something I want to go through. It probably wouldn't be good for anyone involved. As soon as we get to the office, I'll look up the phone number to my primary care physician and set up an appointment for the end of the week. I wasn't able to get much work done for the rest of that morning. After 10 o'clock, I headed to the conference room for a briefing. Our division head had a standard meeting followed by a routine presentation on the case we were working on. When we were done, Wright and I walked out and headed to the break room. We had a normal lunch, after which we headed out to conduct our interview. How long's the drive? I asked Wright as I lowered the window to get some fresh air. About an hour and a half, he responded. I opened the manila folder on my lap, reviewing the backup instructions for our interview. The person we were going to go interview was a 45-year-old divorced man who lived alone. There were some inconsistencies with his tax returns, and our auditors were unable to get a hold of him. Rather, I should say our auditors were unable to keep him on the line after introducing themselves as representatives from the IRS. He has not responded to letters, phone calls, or other forms of communication. It is now on us to get the needed information from him before escalating the case to our enforcement division. As much as people dislike getting a visit from us, we truly always did our best to work with people. I guess that's the part of the reason I always found this job rewarding. Oftentimes, we're the only thing standing between good people down on the luck and a felony charge. I have a bad feeling about this one, I told Wright as I closed the folder on my lap. Let's just get through today. Then you can take a nice week-long vacation while I'm stuck doing your work for you. he responded with a chuckle. Yeah, until I have to come back and fix the mess you've made, I said, shaking my head. We arrived at our interview's location after getting lost for 20 minutes. His house was not easy to find. As soon as we pulled into the driveway, my hands began to shake. I rubbed my hands together to hide it from right. I began to get lightheaded and feel a tingling sensation in my ear. I closed my eyes and told myself it was just in my head. I felt as if something was inside my ear canal, slowly making its way out. I grabbed onto my slacks and focused on the sensation in my ear. It felt as if whatever was in there had stopped, but I could still feel it. It was almost as if it was thinking about whether it should crawl out. Right hit me on my shoulder once again, bringing me back to reality. We're here, he said. Are you sure you're good to go inside? I can honestly do this on my own No, I quickly replied, getting out of the car. I would tell you if I couldn't handle it. Let's go. We walked to the front door as I surveyed the surrounding area. The place looked pretty run down and didn't look very well maintained. Wright knocked on the door a few times, with no response. After a couple more times, I was startled by a man looking out through the window blinds. He retreated and walked behind the door.
Who are you?
He yelled from the other side of the door.
And what do you want?
Hello, Mr. Redfield, I began. My name is Susan.
Who are you?
He interrupted. We're at the IRS, sir. Can you please open the door so we can talk?
Do you have a warrant?
He asked. Sir, we're not police officers. We're not carrying weapons. We're just bureaucrats, that's all. We just need to ask you some quick questions.
What if I don't want to answer your questions?
He retorted. Then there's nothing we can do to help you, Mr. Redfield. The IRS will have no choice but to work with the district attorney's office to file charges. At that point, a licensed peace officer with a warrant will be showing up here. Can we try and see if we can avoid that? After a moment of silence, I heard the door unlock, and he stuck his head outside the door, examining his surroundings.
It's just you two?
He asked. Yes, sir, Wright responded.
And you said you don't have any guns, is that right?
No, sir. We are not peace officers, I responded. After a moment of thinking, he opened the door fully and motioned for us to come inside with his head. As soon as I walked inside, I had to hold my breath as I nearly gagged from the smell. The smell of rot hit me like a brick wall, and I tried my best not to make any discomfort known. Unfortunately, I was unable to fully hide it as Mr. Redfield gave me a dirty glance once he noticed a facial expression.
This way,
he said, leading us to his living room. Wright and I sat on a dirty-looking couch, with Mr. Redfield taking a seat in a couch directly across from us.
Do y'all want something to drink?
He asked. No, thank you, Wright responded. A glass of water would be much appreciated, I responded in a raspy voice, still trying to keep it together. Mr. Redfield gave me a dirty look as he nodded his head in affirmation. He stood up and went into the kitchen.
Jesus Christ, I can't do this,
I whispered to Wright.
How are you holding it together?
What are you talking about? He said with a confused look on his face.
The smell,
I whispered loudly.
The awful smell. What is that? It smells like rotten eggs or something. I don't know what it is, but I've never smelled anything this bad before in my life.
Susan, I literally don't smell anything, he said calmly. This was a mistake. You should go wait in the car. I looked at Wright, wondering if he was playing a cruel joke on me. At this point, I had stopped breathing through my nose entirely. I was breathing through my mouth to stop from throwing up. Mr. Redfield came back into the room with a glass of water in hand. I grabbed the glass and immediately began to drink it. I consumed the glass in a matter of seconds. Mr. Redfield looked at me with a puzzled expression as I gasped for air. "You want more?" he asked. As I gasped for air, I came to the realization that the smell was now gone. I inhaled deeply, and sure enough, everything smelled normally, just like Wright had said. "No, thank you, Mr. Redfield. I was just a little dehydrated, so..." "Mr. Redfield," Wright chimed in as Mr. Redfield took a seat. "We don't want to take up any more of your time than we have. I'm sure you're a busy man." "Not really," Mr. Redfield responded. "I'm retired." "Well, we'd like to be respectful of your time, nonetheless," Wright continued. "We have a list of straightforward questions we'd like to ask you. Would you by any chance have access to your tax returns for the previous 5 years? You're IRS, ain't ya? Don't you?" he replied, not breaking eye contact with Wright. "That's fine. We can ask our questions, and maybe we can sort out the needed documents afterwards, if needed." I handed Wright the manila folder, and he proceeded to ask Mr. Redfield various standard questions, tailored to his specific situation. As he was asking his questions, my eyes were drawn to Mr. Redfield's ear. It looked as if there was a spider inside his ear. I could see a couple of the legs sticking out from his ear canal. I knew in my head that what I was seeing could not possibly be real. It was at this moment that I knew I had made an idiotic decision coming along. Why didn't I listen to Wright and just stay home? I diverted my eyes away from Mr. Redfield and instead looked down at his coffee table. Only I was unable to keep my gaze off him for long. There now appeared to be several spiders crawling around his ear. Some of them crawled to the back of his neck and immediately scratched his neck. I quickly got up from my seat, now realized that it may not be an illusion after all. "What?" Mr. Redfield screamed. "You've been looking at me funny since you got here. What's your problem?" I looked down at Wright, who shifted his eyes between me and Mr. Redfield. His expression conveyed concern. "I'm sorry, Mr. Redfield," I responded. "It must have been the water. Is it okay if I use your bathroom?" "Down the hall, to your left," he said angrily. I quickly made my way down to the bathroom, my face red with embarrassment. I closed the door behind me and turned on the faucet, splashing water on my face. I looked at myself in the mirror and cursed myself for my behavior. Tears began to form in my eyes as the realization hit me that there was indeed something not right going on. As I grabbed on the door handle to make my way out of the bathroom, I caught a glimpse of a fly near the shower curtain. The more I stared at it, the more flies I noticed coming out from behind the curtain. I walked up to the curtain, and the putrid smell of rot once again hit me hard. I covered my nose with my shirt. As I opened the curtains, I was greeted with a massive number of flies coming straight at me, making me fall back, knocking down a shelf on the wall. There's a bathtub full of blood, with what looked like bones sticking out of the bathtub. I immediately opened the door and was greeted by Mr. Redfield, who pushed me in the bathroom. Closing the door behind him, he punched me in the head, and I fell back, hitting my head on the wall. "You shouldn't have been so nosy," he said with a sadistic smile. He grabbed a nearby towel and wrapped it around my head. I began to scream, but my screams were muffled by the towel. He grabbed me and shoved my head towards the bathtub, but I fought him back as hard as I could, kicking and screaming. Eventually, I must have kicked him hard enough that he let me go. I took the towel off my head and screamed as loud as I could for Wright. Wright came rushing in, kicking the door open. "What's going on?" he asked as I lay on the bathroom corner. She just went insane, he replied. She began attacking me, and I had to shove her off me. Wright walked past Mr. Redfield, pushing him out of the way. He helped me to my feet and walked me out of the house. He put me in his car and told me he was going back inside to investigate. Don't go back in there, Wright. I pleaded with him. Please, get in the car and let's get out of here. I'm scared. Just hold on, he said as he headed back inside the house. There's no way he was going to let us get out of here alive. Not after what I witnessed. My anxiety was off the charts. After about a minute, I heard Wright scream my name. He was screaming for me to help him. I looked around and realized I didn't have the car keys. I was thinking about leaving my partner to die, consumed with fear for my life. I took a couple of deep breaths, mustering up the courage to think straight. Wright was my partner, but I was not going to let him die. I opened the glove box and took the gun Wright kept for emergencies, just like this one. I ran towards the house with my body operating purely on adrenaline. I pushed the door open and saw Mr. Redfield running towards me with a giant knife covered in blood. I shot him several times until he fell back onto the ground. Dropping the knife, he immediately tried getting back up, and I shot him several more times on the ground until the last bullet had been fired. I ran to the living room to find Wright on the ground, his head bashed in. I bent down next to his body and immediately began to sob. My crying was interrupted by someone standing behind me. I turned around, gun drawn, and was greeted by Wright. Confused, I looked back down, and his body was no longer there, but it had been there just a second ago. You were right here, I responded. You were right here. I saw you. You were dead. You were right here. Give me the gun, Susan, he said, slowly walking towards me. He took the gun from my hand and sat down next to me. You were right here, I responded. You were right here. I saw you. You were dead. You were right here. He looked at me as tears began to form in his eyes and wrapped his arms around me. You were right here, I responded. You were right here. I saw you. You were dead. You were right there. Tonight's story is by Hair-Raising Narratives. It is called The Interview. If you enjoyed this, please check out his channel and his website. He writes all of his own content. I have been honored to read his stories on this channel. On that note, I also have merch. If you'd like to walk around representing my realm and gaining immunity travelers, the links are in the description below. Also, I'd just like to say a special thank you to my lovely Patreons. 242 Reads, Rando Calrissian, Pam, Silver Threads, Seraphine the Midnight Bard, Creepy Clown Girl, Mia Mina, Philia Noctis, and Hair-Raising Narratives. If you'd like to join these lovely travelers by the light of my fire, you can do so by becoming a Patreon as well. The support is always appreciated, but never expected. And as always, once you step into my realm, there's no stepping